right, I hope everybody's having a great morning. Katie, you just let me know when we're ready to get going.
We're recording. Go ahead and start.
Sounds good. All right. Welcome back to the American Foundry Society's Foundry Sand Beneficial Use webinar series. Last week, our webinar focused on the EPA and USDA risk assessment of spent foundry sand and how states are using the risk assessment to advance beneficial use. Today we'll focus on identifying and promoting opportunities at the foundry level through best management practices and educating your customers by marketing your product. Also, we'll show you where you can find some valuable resources and tools pertaining to beneficial use. Today's agenda, logistical type items we'll cover first. We'll recap what was covered in webinar number 1, introduce our presenters. Brian Esch will then cover best management practices. Jerry Richardson will cover marketing your foundry sand. Mike Lenahan will discuss how beneficial use can be a moving target. Elizabeth Ollenbush will give a glimpse of many of the resources and tools that are available to us. We'll wrap things up and answer any questions that you might have at the end. All the webinar attendees are automatically muted by the webinar software. This is just to avoid any distracting background noises. The webinar is scheduled for 1 hour. You can ask a question at any time by typing it into your webinar control panel. Questions will be answered as appropriate, possibly throughout the webinar, but mostly we'll focus on answering all the questions at the end. So feel free to type in a question at any point. Email addresses for all the presenters will be provided when we introduce the presenters and also on the questions slide at the end of the presentation. So in last week's webinar, Dan Oman gave a very good, concise overview of the US EPA risk assessment, explaining what it is not, and why it is important to the foundry industry, and the benefits it provides. We also heard from a few states on how the risk assessment is helping advance beneficial use rules. Wisconsin, a state with an already well-established beneficial use program, and how the risk assessment might even help make a good program better. We heard from Michigan, a state who recently had success in getting beneficial use rule passed, and the EPA risk assessment was the leverage needed to push it through. And how the Metalcasters of Minnesota have reignited the conversation with the MPCA for streamlining beneficial use for foundries and possibly work towards reform of the beneficial use rules. Again, the risk assessment is and has been the key. The recurring keys to success in states making positive change with regard to beneficial use include using the risk assessment to leverage change, joining forces with the other foundries, trade associations, and other industries, as well as establishing good relationships and positive communication with lawmakers in your state. If you attended the webinar last week or registered to attend, you should have received an email with a link to view and listen to the recording. If you did not, we can make sure you know where you can find it. Also, I want to do a quick apology. Wanted to quickly apologize to anyone who tried to attend last week's presentation and was unable to get in. We had an unexpected error that limited the number of attendees, but hopefully you get the recording and you can always email any of the presenters from last week if you have any specific questions. So feel free to reach out to us and we'll make sure you get the information you need from that. Now let's meet our presenters. Brian Esch, Environmental Coordinator for Waupaca Foundry in Waupaca, Wisconsin. As I mentioned last week, Brian has over 20 years of experience in the foundry industry and has had oversight of beneficial use projects in 4 different states. His vast experience with beneficial use projects makes him an expert, in my opinion, and the perfect person to talk to us about best management practices. Jerry Richardson is an environmental engineer for Amstead Rail in Granite City, Illinois. He is responsible for 1 beneficial use site at the Granite City plant, and for the last few years anyway, has been keeping spent foundry sand out of the landfill through beneficial use as a road base at a local farm. Jerry has a great marketing scheme to get the word out about his spent Foundry sand, and he'll share some of the key components for us to market our that we can use to market our Foundry sand. Mike Lenahan will join us again. Last week I talked about his nickname Stash, but didn't give his decorated career much credit. Mike has worked in the foundry industry for 28 years, attending his first AFS meeting during the first week on the job, so he's been an active member for just as long. He has been the chair of 2 AFS chapters, Northeastern Ohio and Western Michigan, and has been serving on AFS Division 10 committees for 21 years. He's an asset for the foundry industry. Elizabeth Ohlenbusch is president of EO Associates. Now, Russ Murray in particular has been quoted saying she knows more about recycling than anyone I know. That's a pretty big statement, bold statement. She is a former executive director of First Foundry Industry Recycling Starts Today, where she played a major role in initiating dialogue with a number of private and public sector partners. She obtained grants from the Department of Energy, EPA, USDA, and the Federal Highway Administration to support important research and outreach efforts, including what is now the AFS First website and what I would assume is the EPA risk assessment. She has worked for the Wisconsin Recycling Market Development Board. She was responsible for the statewide program for reuse industrial byproducts. Prior to that, she was the director of marketing for Steel Recycling Institute. The way I see it, she's helped write the book on this stuff, and she'll let us know where to find a lot of the tools and resources that we can use for beneficial use. I'm Greg Kramer, the Corporate Environmental Engineer for ME Global in Duluth, Minnesota. I am the self-proclaimed moderator for today's webinar, but having never been involved with a beneficial use project, admittedly, I will be providing zero value to your knowledge on beneficial use today. So let's get started and hear from the folks that understand what really goes into these projects. So our next speaker is Brian Esch. He's going to share some of the essential best management practices. Switch it over to Brian.
Thank you, Greg, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, we'll start off by talking about some best management practices. And if anybody in attending the webinar last week, I think we talked a lot about some of the external forces that are going on, both with the risk assessment and what's happening in some states. And I think you can really look at this information as, what can you do within the Foundry walls to basically guarantee your success and move forward. So I think we're going to start off with something that I think is very cliche in the world of beneficial use, and generally we'll talk about identification and classification of whatever materials you have available on site. And one of the age-old things that you hear is understand what you have, develop a flow diagram of your entire sand handling system. Now, in the case of many foundries, that can be somewhat of a complicated endeavor. You might have many output points where you have different materials that are being generated. You might have some situations where you really want to understand what it is you're generating. So as an example, you may have a location where you have dust that's being generated. You might have some excess sand that's being generated. They're each in their separate silos, and in the end they may be getting combined in one area, and you may have one mix that's leaving. So it's very important to understand, of the materials you have, where are they coming from, and fully understanding their source. And on that, I would add a note that that's going to be very important as you move forward, because when you go from state to state and you look at how different material classifications are done, you might find that your state's going to have a lot of interest in the materials that make up your material you have available for reuse. So if you have, in the case of my earlier example, you have two materials, later when we talk about testing, starting out there may be, and most likely will be, a requirement that you understand the nature of each of those materials. So there may be some testing involved before they ever get mixed. And I think another thing that's important too is to understand the definition of foundry sand in your state. Some some we think of straight up sand, but actually in some states that can include baghouse dusts that were collected off sand conveying systems, or it could even be cores or core butts. So make sure you understand that definition within your state, and as you develop the flow chart for your facility, you can keep in context of those things that are going to be available and applicable for use in that state. And one thing that I think that is often missed straight up is, no matter how wildly successful you are with reuse, whether you are providing material to a great legitimate project, whether you are or what, lost my train of thought here, excuse me. So we'll come back to that in a second. Another thing that we want to do is, we want to have any in-house may exist for the material. So you may have a lot of data on the material that you're using on site. And part of that may be you may have a knowledge of material that is has a use for you. So a lot of times, I guess this is the point that I stumbled on earlier, is here we are spending a lot of time of facilitating and moving beneficial use materials for off-site use. You might have materials that the best use of that material is within the foundry. So it's very unlikely that you're going to move a beneficial use material and make money on it to a degree that's going to have more value to you than in the use in the foundry originally. So maybe one example of that would be if you have an area where you have some maybe muller collection, and it's very likely that the fine sand grains that you're pulling off your muller area might have a high clay content to it. So that clay content may have more value within the foundry than without. So keep that in mind as you're building your flow chart and you're understanding what materials you might have for off-site use. Don't forget the value for things that have in-site use. And so taking all that information that you have, make sure you understand and accumulate what you have gathered historically, and make sure to review your state regulation. And this is where you're going to start collecting representative samples of the materials that you've identified and do your initial beneficial use classification analysis. So keep in mind that will be different from state to state, and so you'll have to make sure you understand what it is you're testing for, and we'll talk about that a little bit. As far as the sample analysis effort itself, other than making sure you get the representative samples and you're considering what we discussed earlier, which would be, if you have things that are getting blended together, work down to the source so that you understand everything going in there. Make sure you work with your contract laboratory and assure that they're familiar with the analysis that you're asking for. So there is, there's probably not dozens of foundries approaching your lab all asking for the same type of beneficial use testing. They're very used to somebody coming in and asking for a TCLP or something of that nature. Make sure they understand that if you're doing an ASTM water leach or whatever it might be that your state requires, that they understand the appropriate method and they're doing that test. Moving on, there's some things we can do to prepare for our success. And one of those things would be segregation and handling practices. So you're going to have many different materials, and as you focus on some of them as being great candidates for an off-site use, make sure that in-house you have ways to segregate those from other materials that would have less possibilities for use. So one example of that may be if you have a great green foundry sand material that can be used, you want to make sure not to get melt dust or something of that nature mixed in there unless you intend it to be, and they're all classified together for that use. So definitely work on the segregation handling practices and preconditioned materials so you can provide a workable and consistent product for your customer. So, think of all the effort that goes into having the high degree of quality and consistency for your usual product, presumably castings, and really if we're going to market this material as an actual product, we have to put all the same care and attention into that as well. So preconditioning it, that could include things such as the removal of any debris, optimizing the moisture. So you may have a blend where you add just enough moisture so that you're preventing dusting. And it could also be a great aid to any kind of excavation handling that goes on later on site. And again, generally just maximizing product consistency. So this is a great thing where foundries really have an edge over a lot of native materials, because if you think in your facilities, it's very likely that you have somebody who dedicates either all their time or a great degree of their time to make sure that your green sand or whatever sand system that you have is being very consistent and providing the needs that you have to make your product. You're going to have a much more homogeneous material than a lot of native materials. That gives you a benefit, and don't forget that. One thing that's really going to help grease the skids is to identify and plan a winning demonstration project. So pick your first project as something that's not terribly complicated, something that has a great PR element to it and a great amount of local community benefit and use. That is a great project to do as your starting project. And as you work to develop such a project, make sure you're communicating with that end user. And basically that, if you do proper communication with the property owner or the ultimate user, you're going to find that over time that they will become one of your strongest advocates. And then perform your testing as needed to validate the nature and consistency of your project. So it varies as we go from state to state, but some states will say that you need to do a test once every couple of years or once every year or whatever the frequency is to basically understand the characteristics of the material. Don't be scared to do additional testing, especially when you're starting out, because having that data and knowing and understanding that consistency is a great benefit when you're communicating with your end users. And when you do that, keep in mind that you have to have both a personal and an organizational mindset that these things that used to be waste, that were a spent foundry material, that once you've tested and confirmed that it's suitable for beneficial use, they're no longer waste in the sense of the original word that they were. They're actually a valuable, potentially construction material that poses a value. And so in doing so, you have to treat the spent material as a product. So all the information, all the background that we would expect from any other product we would buy from anybody should be available for your product as well. So examples of that would be safety data sheets, maybe engineering specifications, and these would be things that to the different stakeholders that are interested in projects, we can share that with them and basically give them the full information on how this product will behave and what to expect out of it. So in the engineering sense, there could be things like the moisture content range for the material, grain size distribution, bulk densities, moisture density curves, all those kinds of things are important. Now we're getting to in what, in my opinion, is one of the most important parts of beneficial use, and following best management practices, is the concept of project management. So in the context of what we're talking about here, project management is just maintaining control of your material. So it could be that in your state, once you're approved and you have all your testing, you may be able to have somebody just drive to the back of your plant with a pickup truck and take loads that will go off to be used in some application. I personally would not recommend that. I would recommend that you continue to maintain a very high level of control. And really, that is the key, in my opinion, to beneficial use, is that project management. So you're applying practices to help you maintain control from the point you generate it to the point it actually gets used in the final project. And one thing that really helps with all that is if you educate your property owners, so not just the initial communication we discussed, but as you go into the project and as you do the project, make sure that the property owners and anybody else involved understands exactly what the project is and what to expect. And if they understand that timeline and the nature of the materials, you're going to have a lot less issues with maybe an adjacent landowner saying, hey, what's that material or that pile of black material over there? What's that all about? And getting upset by it. if you include them all in the process early on, people are going to understand and you're going to avoid a lot of that. In some states, you're going to have some requirements where there are, if it's a certain size project or something of that nature, there might be a public information meeting required. But in a lot of cases, it isn't. So you may want to consider that it may be worth it having a voluntary, kind of preemptive informational meeting just to avoid any later misunderstandings. And it's also, in my opinion, the responsibility of the Foundry to make sure that if they want that success, they have to make sure that the products are developed in a way that conform with any applicable regulation. So it doesn't matter who it goes to, it's always going to be perceived as material from your facility. So you don't want to get caught up in something where the end user ends up filling in a wetland, or there's some major stormwater concern or something of that nature. Make sure that you are there in the upfront and helping and making sure that all those things are going just the way they should. And so, again, I cannot overemphasize that successful beneficial reuse projects, it really has nothing to do with the toxicity of Foundry sand. We talked about that last week in webinar 1. What it really comes down to is project management and a lot of logistics that go around that. So, as you're thinking about those things, there's obviously hauling and staging logistics. So at your project site, do they, how much material do they need? What's their delivery window for getting it? Do you need to stockpile it, or could you deliver it directly from your site? Are there any special material characteristic requirements? Just ensuring that any equipment that's being used to handle material between your facility and the end use, make sure it's all in good condition. Trucks aren't being overloaded. Tarps are in good condition so you don't have dusting on the road. Make sure you want that site to have regular site inspections, whether it's weekly or whatever it is, so you can ensure that there's an adequacy of stormwater controls and water control and dust generation. Maybe you need a tracking pad to keep any tracking off the road. All of this stuff is crucial, and also, ultimately, all the due diligence and everything you're doing and your results, keep good records of all that, and basically what material is going into what projects. So now that we've put a lot of effort into not just understanding our material, but basically making sure that we're keeping an eye on how it's being used and exerting control over that, we don't want to kind of ruin all that later by some change in our process. So another important area is just management of change. So make sure that you're keeping an eye on any changes that might be in your process, whether it's the process itself, changes in raw materials, different alloys, or new equipment you put on site, and all of that. One excellent way to manage that and make sure you don't have like a personnel created change is make sure that all your folks that are involved with this, that they actually have training and work instructions on, okay, if I'm preparing this material or I'm mixing it out of a mixer or whatever it is and putting it into the truck, that they are basically meeting a very set procedure and putting out there a very consistent product. So in summary, I think what we just talked about here the last few minutes, I think most people would agree there's really nothing that's rocket science about this, but it just consists of basic actions that you have control over to make sure that you're properly classifying and exerting control over those materials. So if you're successful in developing and implementing those sorts of controls, it should provide a tremendous kickstart to your marketing efforts, which we will cover next.
All right, thanks, Bryant. We can switch the screens over to Jerry, and Jerry, as Bryant mentioned there, is going to share with us ways to successfully market our Foundry sands.
Go ahead and unmute your phone, Jerry.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg. I will be discussing today how we at Amstead Rail have been successful in marketing our Foundry sand. As you can see in the slide, the for sale sign. It's not necessarily the case as Foundry sand is typically given away and still costs the Foundry money in the form of transportation. The best situation we're still waiting for is a project that will provide the transportation and we will provide the Foundry sand. In the mid-'80s, our facility was able to supply a local levee district to help build up the levees and empty our on-site landfill. Can you identify some companies in the area for networking purposes that provide beneficial reuse outlets for the Foundry sand byproduct that can be used as an alternate raw material? Basically, replace a more expensive raw material in their process. AFS First is a good place to start to identify potential sources for Foundry sand and other Foundry byproducts for reuse. There's no need to recreate the wheel. Cement kilns typically team up with other alternate reuse companies or waste brokers, and they can help us provide alternate. As you communicate with those waste brokers, they're going to be asking for information. Can you provide analytical data showing your material qualifies as beneficial usable waste, and let them do the legwork in addition to yourself contacting potential outlets. This takes time. Be patient, but set reminders on your calendar to call and check on the brokers monthly and quarterly. Word of mouth. This seems to work best in the local area. Many times there are contractors doing civil work for the Foundry or the facility next door, and we'll see the piles of sand or trucks leaving the facility hauling the sand. In our situation, we had a contractor excavating a stormwater retention basin at our facility and was asking about the sand he observed being hauled off-site. At that time, our Foundry sand was taken to a local landfill as alternate daily cover. His family was developing land that they owned and was looking for road base to further develop the project. This was in 2013. The past 3 years, we have solely provided them over 200,000 cubic yards of Foundry sand and has been used as road base and diverted that material from our local landfill. This was a huge cost savings for us, and can still continue to see that cost savings. States and municipalities. As I mentioned earlier, contact your local or regional levee districts or Army Corps of Engineers for potential projects. We're able to offer the free sand for those projects. However, like I mentioned earlier, keep in mind, these take time to develop. In one instance, still in contact with the levee district back in 2012. We're still waiting on a project and working with the Army Corps of Engineers. State DOTs and state forestry or DNRs. Check with the local state agencies for potential road projects, park trails, or parking lots. There will be additional testing requirements with these states. ASTM methods, as Bryant mentioned earlier, compactability, compaction curve, gradation, soil classification, and hydraulic conductivity, are to name a few. Each state is different in what they want to test for. Now, on to the main theme here of creating your marketing flyer, what has worked well for us. You want to show that you're meeting the state's requirements for beneficial waste and examples of how it's used. You'll see here in the picture, the bottom left is our on-site sand screener for our Foundry sand. Also to the right of that, you have our spent Foundry sand being used as road base at our local farm. We've also been successful in sending trials of our Foundry sand to cement kilns via truck and barges, but due to the transportation costs, these were not economically feasible at that time. We still continue to go back and look at those costs with transportation. Analytical data. As Bryant mentioned earlier, analytical data is very key to show that your Foundry sand meets your state's beneficial reuse standards. Here's a summary of our waste classification table. Slide shows the dates samples were collected, parameters analyzed for, sample locations, analytical results, and the limits identifying what type of classification the sand will be deemed based on the results. Certification statement and sieve test. In the state of Illinois, the certification statement must be attached to the bill of lading for each shipment leaving the facility. The sieve test we found to be a common request, so we included this on our flyer also. Depending on your state, your marketing flyer may differ. Our marketing flyer is updated annually with new data generated from the required annual landfill sampling. The marketing flyer is not required, however, it has helped us further our networking capabilities to market our sand. When people ask what type of sand do you have, can we use it, easiest thing to do is send them the flyer. Everything most of the questions they have are answered on the flyer. So here's our final marketing flyer. The top of the flyer identifies that it's beneficial, usable Foundry sand. It includes a brief description of how the sand is generated from our process, states that it meets the beneficial, usable standards, and cites the regulation for your state. Also includes pictures of the sand screening and material used as road base. On the second page, we cite the regulations from the state's requirements for the beneficial usable waste and how they can use it. Includes the analytical data, the certification statement, and the sieve test, and probably the most important be the contact information. Thanks for your time today, and I hope you are as successful as we are at Amstead Rail as marketing our Foundry sand.
All right, thanks, Jerry. We'll switch over to Mike Linehan now, and he'll give us some insight on some of the inherent variables associated with beneficial use.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks again for being here today. I wanted to plant some seeds with you relative to some things you may run into as you move your sand into the marketplace. Jerry's presentation really set the stage for some of the nuances that I'm going to cover. So let's talk about moving targets. Most of you know a little bit about a moving target, and most of you that know me or have seen me talk about reuse in the past know that I often refer to transportation as the killer of all deals. The reality is there are many variables tied to transportation that can really make or break your economics. I mentioned my northern Foundry brethren in particular because we actually have a high trucking season, that same season where you can see the orange barrel, otherwise known as the state flower of Michigan. An advantage we see, trucking companies may really love to work with you in a slower season for them with your beneficial use tonnage because it tends to keep their best drivers busy in the winter. It makes for a better time to negotiate truck rates going into a slow season if you're that Foundry. So you need to think of those things. You need to be aware that the rates can go up and down depending upon how busy that hauler is. It comes back to the old economic theory of supply and demand. Key element, really the Foundries must communicate with those trucking companies or the truckers they're working with. You really need to understand the trucking business a little to be successful. Just like gold, Foundry sand can vary in value depending upon an end user and how badly they need material. Believe it or not, even landfills have a high and low demand cycle. Even when the case of sending material in the form of daily cover to a landfill, if they've got an ability to spread material easier in the colder weather, or they're struggling to get things like soils used for cover, Foundry sand can be more valuable to them. So it's important to learn those cycles as well. This next slide really should fall under the category of obvious information. But number one, you really need to know your state regs. We talk about this in all of our parts of the presentation, but it's critical and worth mentioning again. The other thing to know about them is know that they can change. I think it's imperative that if you have a state association such as OCMA Wisconsin Cast Metals, FAM, etc., that you stay involved. Those folks usually help us monitor what's going on state to state. So that's really time well spent. Number two, really understand the storage rules. With the ebb and flow of material and product demand from reuse to reuse, you can see this being a significant issue. Many states have storage requirements or limitations on that, and that's something you want to watch carefully. The moving target relative to being a salesperson, you are now selling a commodity, or maybe you're not selling it, but you're getting rid of the material for less than it cost you to dispose of it before. Again, study your customer. If you're selling, you're likely going to have competitors. Be ready for pushback when you displace somebody. When choosing where to market your material, think about a sustainable partnership. Bryant really did a great job in the presentation slides earlier on this. I can't emphasize enough the importance to align yourselves with a reputable end user or reputable end users. Someone saving a dime by using your material is okay as long as they're not cutting a corner. That old saying about if it sounds good to be true, sounds too good to be true, needs to be in the back of your head at all times. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Elizabeth Olenbush, who will cover resources and tools.
Okay, Elizabeth, if you would share your screen and unmute your phone.
Shannon, just a second. I'm having trouble getting to the right slide. Be right with you. Okay, here we are. Now it keeps reverting. Shannon, can you see my screen?
Yes, we see your screen, but not your presentation.
Not my presentation. That's not good.
There we go. I see your presentation.
Okay, let me just get to the slideshow view. Sorry, attendees. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is a number of tools and resources that were developed by AFS First and other partners over the last decade or so. For those of you who are newer to the industry, FIRST was a consortium formed by AFS and the State Metal Casting Associations in 1999 to focus attention on beneficial use of foundry sand at a time when EPA and many state regulators believed that all foundry sands were hazardous. Seriously. Dan Oman and several other people on this call were in those initial meetings, and I can't even begin to tell you how far we as an industry have progressed with the foundry sand risk assessment. First other objective was to develop technical information supporting the use of foundry sand in many different common construction activities where it can substitute for virgin sand, and you've just heard some of the applications from some of our other presenters. I'm going to briefly walk you through how to find web-based information that will help you in a number of areas. For the first webinar, talked a lot about expanding regulatory acceptance. We talked more about finding markets in this one, and there are lots of other downloadable resources. I do want to emphasize that there's lots of information on beneficial use of foundry sand, so you do not have to reinvent the wheel if you're charged with expanding beneficial use in your facility. And we do suggest, and Greg's made that reference before, that one of the places you may want to start is spending some time prowling around on the AFS First website. So how do you get there? For those of you who haven't looked at this resource, there are two ways to do it. The most obvious one is to go to the AFS website, the drop-down menu under Government and EHS, to the AFS First recycling homepage. And you can see on the left-hand side of your screen that there are a number of subsections to this website. I'm going to come back to those in a minute, but first I want to tell you where you can locate this risk assessment if you didn't take notes from last week. You can download the risk assessment from the main US EPA Foundry Sand page which can be found at the link on this slide. There are also several links to it on the AFS First website that will take you directly here. And of course, if you forget, you can do an internet search, type in US EPA Foundry Sand Risk Assessment, and download the risk assessment directly. All 477 pages of delightful bedtime reading. However, if you missed last week's webinar, go to the archive version and listen to Dan Oman's excellent 20-minute Cliff Notes version of the risk assessment, which really covers all the main points that you need to know. A couple of other ways in which you may want to use the risk assessment in your local marketing efforts. You could download the risk assessment fact sheet, which is on the same page that was referenced before. It briefly summarizes an EPA fact sheet, so many of our members have found that it's very useful to hand this out directly as part of their marketing information because it's an EPA document, not a Foundry industry document. And I wanted to indicate, Jerry showed you some of ANSTED's marketing materials, but I also wanted to indicate that some foundries have started to use that information and reference it directly in their marketing material. And on that same main page of the EPA Foundry Sand website, there are many other links, one of which is a link to frequently asked questions that EPA prepared. And again, if you are dealing with skeptical regulators, sometimes it's helpful to send them directly to EPA. If they don't believe us, they certainly typically will believe the US government, ha-ha. I don't have time to walk through them all today, but I wanted to point out several other places that you can get to tools that may help you with your state regulators through the AFS First website. To get to them from that main web page, take a look at the environmental profiles page link, which is down again on the left-hand portion of your screen. And if you click on that, it will take you to a couple of different places, one of which is the regulatory references, which is on the left-hand side of this screen, and another one of which is the EPA tools and resources, only a portion of which you can see in these screenshots. I did want to mention, if you're located in a state where you really don't know how to get started with beneficial use, or you're a foundry that doesn't really have that doesn't have access to a state metal casting association, one place to start to discover what your beneficial use rules are is this last link on the right-hand side of your page, which is the Foundry Sand Reuse State Resource Locator. This is a database that was put together by the National Center for Manufacturing Sciences about 10 years ago with support from US EPA. On that website, there's a drop-down menu that will take you to every state, take you into their beneficial use rules. And at least what's important about that, in my opinion, is not so much that the rules will be current, because it hasn't been updated lately, but that it will tell you what office to call in your state that's responsible for beneficial use. Now I want to go on back to what you can do with Foundry Sand. And as Jerry and Brian have mentioned before, how the AFS First website can take you to resources that will help you determine what uses for Foundry Sand may be appropriate for your foundry. From the application section of the website, there are pages on each of these main applications for Foundry Sand. What I think we all need to emphasize, and Mike and Brian and Jerry I think will tell you this, is that not all of these applications are going to be appropriate for every foundry. As Mike said and Jerry said and Brian said, what's going to work for you is going to depend in large part upon what is available to you in your geographic area. While many foundries have had success in the past, for example, with sending foundries into cement kilns, typically the cement kilns charge them to do that. And typically there's a long transportation distance required. So while that may have been the only option for some foundries in the past, today, as the state regulations are becoming more realistic, many foundries may find that working with local contractors for road base or for blended aggregate road bases or for sub-bases, structural fields, and embankments may in fact make a whole lot more sense than trying to ship your material out of state to a cement kiln. One of the other resources that is helpful for you to sometimes use with local contractors is a publication that is downloadable both from the FIRST website and from the Federal Highway website. And this is a publication called Foundry Sand Facts for Civil Engineers. Early in its existence, FIRST approached the Federal Highway Administration about taking a look at foundry sand as a construction aggregate and substitute for virgin sand. It's important to remember, of course, that Federal Highway doesn't actually build a single-lane highway or roadway anywhere in this country, but what they do influences and frequently finances highway construction throughout the country. So Federal Highway's leadership on accepting foundry sand has turned out to be important in getting many DOTs to accept the use of foundry sand, and working backwards toward your community, what the DOTs do frequently influences whether your local highway department will allow the use of foundry sand in their projects. So getting DOT to do this fact book, to produce this fact book, which was actually produced under contract by a third-party engineering firm, was a pretty significant breakthrough in the ability of the foundry industry to say, look, we have these materials, they perform as well, if not better than, other conventional materials used in engineering projects. And there are other resources on the Federal Highway website that you can access from that same location. Another source for technical information on foundry sand is a series of webinars, each of them an hour long, that were produced by University of Wisconsin engineering professors. For those of you from that part of the world, you'll recognize the names of Dr. Craig Benson and Dr. Tuncer Edel, who've been working with working at the University of Wisconsin and with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation on industrial materials for 20 years. So they are very familiar with some of the projects that Bryant was discussing that other foundries in Wisconsin have successfully provided sand for many decades. And they produced a series of webinars which you can access through the Recycled Materials Resource Center's website. Also on that page, if you look under the materials section, is a document that was produced by Federal Highway and updated about 7 years ago called the User Guidelines for Waste Materials. And while all of us who work on industrial byproducts hate using the term waste, unfortunately, when this project was conceived 20 years ago, that's what they were considered. So there's a whole section on foundry sand in there. In some cases, there are technical requirements for the types of testing, the types of sieve analysis that are useful if you're trying to say to a local contractor, look, my sand will meet these requirements. Now, I wanted to take you back to the AFS website and talk about a couple of other technical resources there. One is the presence of a whole bunch of case studies that were produced by various partners for AFS and AFS FIRST over the years. And these are all downloadable, and you can also access them through the AFS FIRST library. And that's where I'd sort of like to close by reminding you that the AFS library is a tremendous resource for a lot of background information on the use of foundry sand. One of the things that FIRST did early in its inception was to go out and gather documents from all the states. And what we ended up with was well over 200 research reports, mostly from third-party places like Excellent Engineering schools at Michigan Tech, at Penn State and Ohio State, the University of Illinois, University of Wisconsin, and we gathered all those reports, digitized them, and with the help of AFS, they're all uploaded into the AFS library. So you can search by an individual topic, by asphalt, by concrete, by cement, which of course are two different things, and look for documentation that can also help you convince your marketing partners that this has actually been done for a very long time, even if they haven't done it. So I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Greg here. I'll be available for questions at any time. And I just wanted to remind you that we've just touched the surface here. There's much, much more in terms of resources available to you, most of which is on the web. But remember to call your Foundry colleagues, and ask them what they've done to be successful. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. You know, one important thing that I want to add to it, and goes along with marketing, and it also goes along with the resources and tools, is that just because the EPA released a risk assessment for spent foundry sand and they call it good, don't assume that your state has read it or seen it or are aware of it. You know, they may have heard it at a meeting or something, but you really need to hand them a copy. You know, I mean, that was the case for us in Minnesota when we reignited the conversation with MPCA earlier this year. I'm sorry, about a year ago. They hadn't seen it. They didn't know about it. So all these resources and tools are good for you, but they're also good to show your regulators. Anyway, so good talk, Elizabeth, and now we'll just do a quick conclusion here. So Bryant talked about or gave us a good understanding of what we need to do to ensure our customer gets a good, clean, and consistent product through best management practices, from identifying opportunities to controlling the processes that generate the spent foundry sand, and maintaining good record keeping. Marketing our foundry sand effectively is also necessary to achieve success. Jerry has shown that they've had good success with their marketing schemes. We need to treat our foundry sand as a commodity, as was mentioned a couple of times, or a product that's got value. And maintaining material specification sheets and data sheets will make it much easier to grab your customer's attention. Beneficial use can be a moving target, as Mike mentioned. You know, changing transportation costs, changing in value of your spent foundry sand, and the variable demand of the end users. So you got to keep your head on a swivel. And then Elizabeth just got done with all those resources and tools that we have. Again, don't assume that other people know it's there. You know, share it with them and make it useful. These resources are only of value if we use them. With that, we'll go to Katie. I haven't seen any questions pop up, so I don't know if you have, or if we just don't have any questions at this point. But you can contact your presenters today with any questions that you have, and you can also contact presenters from last week with any questions on any of this stuff. And you know, this is obviously a tough one to write down, but if you can email me, gkramer@meglobal.com, if you need to find out where to get that recorded version of last week's, and also are registered for this week's presentation, you should be getting an email with a link to the recorded version of that. So Katie, did you have any questions that rolled through?
No, I did not receive any questions.
Wonderful. Well,
actually,
then,
Greg?
Yeah.
Greg? No, we're just receiving comments thanking us for the presentation. That's all that's coming through right now. So.
Well, that works for me. So feel free to contact us if you have any questions, and thanks for attending this Foundry Sand webinar.